Good evening. My name is Monica Emerson, and I'm here this evening at the invitation of Dr. Chandra Scott to speak with the OU Pontiac initiative on eradicating racism toward economic mobility. I'm hoping that the audience will take away some of the challenges that are faced in the workplace today, and also some best-in-class initiatives that will help move the needle forward.
All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this damp Thursday afternoon. We appreciate you coming out for this courageous conversation about eradicating racism. My name is Anisha Hanna. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Initiatives with the Pontiac Collective Impact Partnership. In the absence of our Executive Director, Dr. Semino Scott, we have our other team members here, Mr. Cal Talley, who's our Director of Data Hub, and Mr. Christopher Rutherford, who's our Director of Network Facilitation. So again, on behalf of PCIP, we thank you. In early 2022, we began this conversation about racism here in the city of Pontiac, and we brought in a group called the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, and they're a national and international collective of anti-racism, multicultural community organizers and educators that are dedicated to building an effective movement towards social justice. And so they came and they hosted their signature event called Undoing Racism. And so they challenged all of us to analyze the structures of power here in the city of Pontiac and the privileges that hinder social equity, as well as prepared us to think effectively about organizing ways for justice here in the city of Pontiac. So a few months ago, we had a conversation with my professor, Dr. Robert Martin, and we were talking about the work that they're doing with the initiative for eradicating racism. And a lot of people that participated in our Undoing Racism wanted to know what was next. How do we continue this conversation as it relates to racism here in the city of Pontiac? So as many of you are familiar with Pontiac Collective Impact Partnership, you know our sole purpose is to bring about social and transformational change here, systems changes here in the city of Pontiac. So through our work and just promoting and working towards economic mobility here in the city of Pontiac, ultimately we want to see social systemic changes here in our work. So as we had the conversation with Dr. Martin and he introduced us to his team, we thought this would be a good way to continue that conversation that we had about undoing racism and moving it towards eradicating racism. So I'm now going to introduce Dr. Shonda Scott, Dr. Robert Martin, and Dr. Danielle Lagaki to come, and they're going to share more with you about their work at Oakland University with the initiative for eradicating racism. Dr. Shonda? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's so good to be here with you this evening. My name is Dr. Shonda Scott. I'm a professor in the Department of Human Resource Development at Oakland University. I'm also the diversity specialist for the Office of the Dean, and I'm the coordinator of the new Human Diversity and Social Justice Certificate Program. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for coming out. My name is Danielle Lagaki, and I am an associate professor and new department chair in the Department of Teaching and Learning at Oakland University. I've been working with my amazing partners here for the last 3 or 4 years or so on this work. I've been in Oakland for 8, and prior to that, I taught junior high in the Chicago area for 12 years.
Hi there, I'm Robert Martin, and I am on faculty in the Department of Organizational Leadership. I work with teachers who aspire to become principals, and am excited to be a part of this initiative for eradicating racism with my co-conspirators. Before coming to Oakland U, I worked in private and public education here in southeastern Michigan. Started off as a high school choir teacher, then became a high school administrator, middle school administrator, and then central administrator. So this is my third act with working with Oakland U and with the Initiative for Eradicating Racism. So thank you so much for being here. So we're going to spend a few moments talking with you about who we are. I'm not going to read the slides to you, but I'm just going to talk a bit about what brought us to this point of starting this initiative. Basically, we started as a group of colleagues who were very concerned about issues of individual and systemic racism that were not being spoken to. And we optimized the moment, which was a horrific moment in society with George Floyd's murder in 2020, to jump at the moment to work with our administration to form this initiative to begin specifically speaking to racism, individual, collective, and systemic racism, as compared to there was already an established diversity, equity, and inclusion committee, and we are supportive of that, but we wanted to target and zero in on racism. We have identified practices that are going on in pre-K 12 and higher ed and society that we are wanting to speak out against, and that we hope to help the community to begin to mobilize and work toward eradicating racism. This is our first opportunity with the Pontiac Collective to be able to work with the community group. We're very excited to do that, other than the fact that I was deeply impressed with Anisha in class and her contribution and growth. We've been very, very pleased with working with Dr. Scott, the administrator, and getting to know the rest of the team and being able to help Pontiac come together with making a difference. We have done a lot on faculty with the OU staff, such as working in presentations and classwork and trainings and articles that we have published to really move not only the academic community, but the community at large in really beginning to have these conversations and move these conversations forward. The need is there. The need continues to be there. We know that there are achievement disparities that are happening within our schools, not only schools in under-resourced, marginalized communities, but there are achievement disparities in our middle and upper class suburban districts. So there's a need across the board for educators to really look at this and to really begin to make some differences. We all know that there have been some issues in some of our schools in the last few years with racist tropes, racist graffiti, and districts are struggling with trying to find the appropriate method and the appropriate consequences and to respond. But what we hope to move is to move toward proactiveness so that you are building a culture and building the capacity within your leaders and your teachers that would prevent and cut this off at the head before it becomes a major issue. But we also know that there are issues that are happening with individuals coming into school districts and coming into communities and trying to create issues that we're really trying to stop happening. Yeah, and I've talked about the articles. You see that, I don't want to go on blah, 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 because you're here to hear our keynote, and I want to hear her also. We will have an opportunity at the end for questions and answers. So if you have some questions about what we're doing at OU and the Initiative for Eradicating Racism, please feel free to ask. We're very open to questions. We're very open to suggestions and recommendations. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Dr. Martin. I have the privilege to introduce our keynote speaker tonight. I'm very excited. I've known her for several years during my 26 years at Oakland University as an educator, and she has just been an outstanding mentor and a person to know. Monica E. Emerson is the founder and president of the Monica E. Emerson Inclusive Performance Solutions, which is located in Michigan. It is a multi-service human resources consulting firm. Services that she provides there include diversity and inclusion solutions and training. In addition to her work with that, she has an experience in working with Chrysler's DEI efforts as a diversity champion and leader there for several years. She also has experience working with the United States Department of the Navy in the area of diversity and inclusion. So at this time, it gives me great pleasure to bring to you Monica E. Emerson. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. I really do appreciate it. And I want to commend all of you for taking your time out and working on this important initiative. I think as you do this, you're going to see that you're going to not only make your communities better, but the individuals inside of them and corporations. So clearly, there's a lot of benefit to the work that you're doing. And it is my desire and hope that you will continue it, and I'll be able to support you in other ways. So when Dr. Scott first invited me to speak to you, she said that the topic would be eradicating racism to improve economic mobility. And my initial reaction was eradicate. And I said, surely you jest. And Dr. Scott said, no. And she was deadly serious. She said, it can't just undo racism. We have got to get rid of it forever. So that was sort of my challenge. So, but never being one to kind of shy away from a challenge, I began reflecting on the different factors that impact economic mobility. And there are many of them. It's like a life cycle, if you will. It starts with health and healthcare, working conditions, education, access to both quality and equity, social protections, technology work opportunities, fair wages, working conditions, inclusive institutions. So when we talk about economic mobility, we're covering a lot of ground, and as it should be. So not having time to address all of them this evening, I thought I would take on the issues of businesses and the work environment, because that's where my experience has been, and also because I believe that through businesses, they'll have a great impact on the actual wages and compensation that people have, and therefore contribute greatly to their economic mobility. So I began thinking about all of the institutions, private, public, businesses, healthcare, educational institutions, religious institutions, government and military, social and civil rights groups, who all for many years have been working on this. And I thought about all of the billions, and that's billions would it be, dollars that have been spent in this area. All of the DEI officers and offices that have been established, all of the training conferences, the employee resource groups, the awards program, diversity councils and committees, let alone the research books and articles that have been written and published on undoing and eradicating racism. Without a doubt, some progress has been made. We've all seen, and you'll hear this often, our very first, African-American president, our first African-American woman vice president, our first African-American Supreme Court justice, and so many more firsts. And I'm proud of every single one of them. But still, there hasn't been enough progress on a much larger scale. Remember, it's been 60 years since the Civil Rights Act of 1964, 60 years. And billions with a B dollars have been spent, and yet mass progress is just too slow. There have been thousands of professionals working in these areas across all sectors of our country. But could it be that tackling, uprooting racism once and for all is really out of reach for us? An impossible dream? Well, in the words of Nelson Mandela, he says, it's always impossible until it's done. And that's what we're here to do. So I thought tonight we might look at initiatives that have been implemented, what works, what doesn't work, and most importantly, why and why not. To be clear, I believe that where there is a will, there is a way. And I also believe that leading diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative is some of the most important work that can be done for employers, companies, our communities, and our nation as a whole. We must do this work. Globalization requires that we change. The demographics of the United States are changing rapidly. There's nothing we can do to turn that around or slow it down. We are, as some people refer to, a minority majority country. In other words, those groups that make up or comprise what we would typically call minorities are now in the majority. For many years, we've had more black and brown babies born in this country than white children, and as such, you can't stop that. That train has left the station. But it's not just the demographic changes, it's the technological advances, the speed of communication, and the fierce war for talent. And I have to tell you that that's really what it's all about. When you look at the United States and our standing and where we have been as it relates to educational achievement, you'll note that we have slipped considerably from where we were number one and number two. When you look at where we are with regard to science and technology, we've slipped. So without a doubt, this is important for us. This is important work for us to do. So, like I said, I'm going to talk more about the African American experience this evening, but I strongly believe that as we improve our institutions, our processes, and our policies for Black Americans, it benefits everybody. So, if we can just step back a minute, following the murder of George Floyd in 2020, many CEOs and company leaders were confronted by Black employees. You'll remember there were marches and demonstrations across the world. And employees were outraged about this situation that stunned the nation. Not that we didn't know that these types of experience existed, but we all saw it, broad daylight, on our television sets over and over again. So Black employees went to their CEOs, and the CEOs were definitely willing to meet with them this time around. And they said that they felt that they were underrepresented in the companies at the senior levels. They felt that they were undervalued and underutilized and not recognized for their skills and talent. Employees went on to say that they were treated unfairly with respect to advancement opportunities within the company, and that they went on to say that there are so few of them that they often feel isolated and ignored. And this is particularly true in large organizations. And they said that the work environment was hostile and discriminatory. They continued to say that the selection process was unfair, and that supervisors and managers were prejudiced, and that they selected their favorites for high visibility assignments and promotional opportunities. The CEO said that he understood their concerns and he was committed to make change. Following the meeting, he sat back and he was stunned. He had never dreamed that the situation for Black employees was as bad as they had depicted it to him. So he wanted to do something about it. So he started a diversity program, and he needed to have somebody to be responsible for it. So following the meeting, when he was all alone, he began to think about his leadership team and who among them could be causing these problems. The last thing he needed was for these concerns to get out into the public sphere, or worse yet, for a lawsuit to happen. So what he did was he wondered how human resources had let this get so out of hand, and he called in his human resources vice president. And he shared with her the conversation and said that he was leaving it up to her to make this problem go away. So the VP of HR went back, understanding the seriousness, and decided to appoint a new diversity manager to lead the diversity strategy. And so she wanted to be able to go back and tell the CEO what great things they were doing. And she was really feeling the heat. So the newly appointed diversity manager felt the pressure, but saw it as an opportunity to perhaps get a promotion for herself. So let's stop here and unpack the situation. Where do we start? So a lot of corporations responded to the murder of George Floyd by hiring chief diversity officers. Diversity, equity, and inclusion roles increased by 55% in 2020. That's a lot. Then many companies pledged hundreds of thousands of dollars to address social change. So given this new surge of energy and commitment, one might expect that this time Black employees would see a major change. But no, not so fast. By the end of 2022, the attrition rate for DE&I, that's your diversity, equity, and inclusion roles, was 33%. So a 33% attrition rate. Wow. And this was stunning because they were finding that after the heat was off, after the marches, protesters had gone and, right? So they started to roll back these programs. So in another survey, I think it was important to share with you is that Black employees represent only 3.8% of chief diversity officers. So that's a very small amount when you consider all of the businesses and corporations that have somebody leading their diversity. The less than 5% are Black, less than 4% actually. And white people made up 76.1% of DE&I roles, and Hispanic and Latino made up about 7.8, and Asians were 7.7. So of the lead diversity, equity, and inclusion roles, Black people were in the minority in terms of leading these initiatives. And additionally, the DE&I professionals at these companies reported to human resources. And this is significant because most of the heads of the departments of human resources were white women. So in these roles, and I bring these statistics to you because race matters. Black employees felt that when they brought their problems to white women, that they were seen as disgruntled employees or simply complainers. And even though they may have been bringing it to their attention to actually hope that there would be a solution to make it better, they found themselves further isolated and alienated from their work teams. So Black employees began to keep a lot of their concerns to themselves. And that's unfortunate because that allowed problems to fester. So many companies began to see DEI roles as a dead-end job. Okay, people shunned away from it. Oftentimes, employers would place employees who were not doing well in their function and just shift them into DE&I. So you go do diversity. And so there were a lot of red flags with these situations. Starting with the fact that the initiative was started as sort of a defensive move against what was happening in society and was quite disingenuous with respect to what they really wanted to accomplish. DE&I officers or professionals who led this initiative generally had no resources or very little resources in terms of budget and staffing. The placement in the organization was too far down from the CEO. And any of you who've worked in large corporations know that, you know, where you are on the hierarchy matters when you need to have a dialogue with senior leaders. If you're 2 or 3 levels below them, you're likely not to get the attention that you would if, for example, you reported to the CEO and they knew you had the ear of the CEO. It makes a big difference. Also, there was a lack of a vision, mission, and strategy that should have been put together by the leadership team, not just put on one person to go fix it or do it and put it together, because there's no ownership when just one individual does it. There was a lack of a training strategy at all levels of the corporation. Sometimes they would say, well, we need some unbiased training. And so whoever has a problem in their area, they would say, okay, you need to send your people to training. But there wasn't a strategic training strategy that was ongoing and addressed every level in every part of the organization. And there was truly a lack of ownership by the CEOs and top leaders. And many times the DE&I officers I mentioned before was really ill prepared. However, there were some good things that were happening. There are some award-winning practices available to make meaningful change. In fact, according to McKinsey & Company, diversity matters even more. And they're showing that even though we're in a situation now where there's a real pushback in some areas against DE&I training, and in fact DE&I departments and initiatives, that it really does matter to business. And that businesses that embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly at the highest levels, really see a financial benefit and are stronger corporations and organizations in the long run. And this is important because we've talked so much about the business benefit for diversity. And I think initially folks thought there would be one-off for every black person you hire, your stock would go up 1 or 2%. But that's not the way it works. It's that when you have women and blacks and other ethnic minorities in your leadership team, where they not only have a seat at the table, but they have a voice at the table that is heard and listened to, that the company is able to make better business decisions. And in fact, their profitability was much greater, 12 to 35% better over the long haul. So one of the things that has happened is that there's a Global Parity Alliance that looked across all the different industries, and they wanted to come up with initiatives that resulted in significant, quantifiable, scalable, and sustainable impact. So I looked at those in preparation for my talk with you this evening and found that there were 5 factors that were common among DE&I initiatives that had significant impact. The first was a nuanced understanding of root causes. All too often, we want to make the problem go away quickly without understanding why it was there in the first place. And all too often, we don't like to ruffle feathers. So we didn't necessarily get to the root cause of the problem. And in order to do this, you have to really get into the data analytics of your company to identify what the root causes are. In fact, that means you've got to have access to data. And when I say data, I'm not just talking about hiring or selection, I'm talking about compensation. And that becomes a very touchy subject in some areas, right? Because now you're really opening up to a person who's in a role, but you're not really, you like the person, okay, but you're not really sure if this person fits in. And all of a sudden, they're saying, I need access to all your data. But you need access to the data in order to prioritize the problem. You see, sometimes people carry, and I found in work that I've done, they will carry comparable titles that have very different scopes of responsibility and very different levels of compensation. So when I start asking questions like, let me see who the top 10 people, highest paid people in your company, let me see who the top 20 highest paid people in the company, and then I want to look through those lists and see how many African Americans on that list, how many blacks, how many Latinx folk. That can make folks a bit uncomfortable. So, but it's important to do that. It's hard to put the strategy together to fix a problem if you don't know what the problem is. The other thing is to have a meaningful definition of success. What is it that you want to have happen? You know, to have clear and quantifiable aspirations. And I found that word interesting because initially, years ago, we talked about having clear, quantifiable goals. And then that took off, and folks said, well, you can't have goals because that's like quotas. And so we call them aspirations now. But you need a clear case for change that everybody knows about. And you need to hold your business leaders accountable. So senior leaders need to be accountable for outcomes, not just input and activities. One of the things I was brought to my attention when I was working with the Department of the Navy is even in 1948, when President Truman said we're going to desegregate the forces, that, in 2010, they were putting together a military leadership commission to find out why we hadn't made more progress in that area. And they determined that it was really important for our military to have diversity, not just in the listed area, because it was close to 50%. Blacks, Latinas, and women and so forth, but not at the senior level, not when you got to the generals and the admirals and 3-star, 4-star. Very, very few. And the problem with this is, and it happens at a lot of companies, is that companies and the military all believe that they promote based on a meritocracy. They say, we advance the best people, period. We don't look at color. So when folk who are of color look up and don't see anybody like themselves represented in that ranks, it erodes the trust. And trust is an important factor in moving the needle forward. Because in essence, what it's saying is, if you're telling me you only promote the best and you don't have anybody that looks like me, you don't think that I qualified. So there were those kinds of hidden messages. So holding senior leaders accountable made a huge difference. And I will digress one moment to say, and that was one of the things that during my experience with the Navy, that the Chief of Naval Operations, who was really the top person there, started to hold accountable his 3- and 4-star admirals for not just for diversifying leadership, but also for the culture in the organization. What was it like? And they started having conversations. And the Chief of Naval Personnel would have conversations with just women and say, what is it like to be a woman in the Navy? Or just blacks, and say, what is it like for you? Recognizing that the experiences are different. So leaders were being held accountable. They were expected to be role models and lead for change. And they were to ensure that the resources were there in the budget. This is so important. I can't tell you how many times I've been asked to work on initiatives where there was like no other resource, and I was supposed to work across the whole company and up and down. So that calls for some strategic engagement, where I determined that if you work well with people, you'd be surprised the number of people that you can cause to want to be on your team, even if they're not on your payroll. And that makes a difference as well. And the fourth thing was solutions had to be designed for the context, right? Develop solutions that address the root cause with scalability in mind and integrate those changes into key processes. That is probably one of the most important things that a diversity leader can do. That is to look at the processes that drive the outcomes, whether that's your hiring process, your selection process, development, advancement, is to really understand those processes. To make sure you got a policy that clearly articulates what is supposed to happen, that the process by which it should happen, the how you want it to happen, should be laid out. In addition to that, you want to look at the practice oftentimes what you'll find, or a company will say, oh, we got a great policy. We don't discriminate against anybody. Here it is, Monica. You can take it and pass it out to everybody, right? But then you find you really get into the policy, and then you start looking at what people do, the practice. And you find that they really may not be adhering to that policy. That they say there are exceptions. For example, we're going to have job postings. So any job that's open, we're going to make it public. So any employee who has that interest and the qualifications can self-nominate and be considered. Employees got really excited about that. And what happened? So John, who was a manager, left to get another job. That seat was open. Employees started getting excited about nominating themselves, getting their resumes together and whatnot, only to find out that the next day the new person was sitting in the seat. Right? There was no interviewing. There was no consideration of other folk. The director just decided to promote that person. Those kind of actions erode trust in an organization. It sours the culture, and it really will turn employees off to the extent that they may leave, but some of them may not leave. They just may come every day and do the minimum they need to do to get by and go home. So you're losing money. You know, if you're paying somebody $100,000 and they're only giving you 60% of their talent and effort, that's like a 40% loss per person. So this was probably one of the most serious concerns that employees had. And managers, directors, did not want to necessarily, I'm not saying all of them, but many of them didn't want to give up the power and authority to just pick somebody and put them in the position. They didn't want to have to maybe bring somebody into particularly a higher level position that they didn't feel they had a prior relationship with and they really knew that person. Well, so if you didn't happen to know the director, you worked in another department, you may never have gotten an opportunity. So we had to fix that and make sure that we began to, and this was the fifth thing they said, rigorously track and course correct if possible. So we had to find out where those kind of selective placements were occurring and sort of cut it off at the root. And again, we had to do this with training, with diplomacy, because otherwise you can bring in someone, an African American who's well qualified, into a high position, and the other folks there in that department will be waiting for them. You know, because they feel like this particular African American woman got Joe's job. That was the job that Joe was supposed to have. So if you don't do this work properly, it can cause more problems. So you've got to track it. You've got to use data, and you've got to give feedback to the managers, directors, whomever is doing that, and help them understand that their own appraisal relative to people development, their own compensation will be impacted by those types of decisions. So again, there are a number of things like that. Succession planning, for example, which lead to who's going to get the highest positions in the organization. But how do you prepare people for that? Because very often we say, well, we want to promote the best people. And you may have had Nancy sitting in a job for 15 years, getting outstanding ratings every year. And she wants to get promoted, but Nancy's never done anything but that one job. No one looked at her development and said, what other experiences does she need, even if they weren't promotion, to broaden her level of knowledge and skill set so that she was more promotable. So when somebody looks at their appraisal ratings and say, look, for 10 years, I've got outstanding ratings, but I can't get promoted, they may not understand why, but that D&I officer ought to understand why. So clearly those are some good practices that need to take place. And I don't mean to paint a picture that is really gloom and doom, but we got a long ways to go. I mean, since 2020, the number of Black CEOs in Fortune 500 companies has doubled. Sounds great, huh? They went from 4 to 8 in 2023, 2 of which are Black women. We got a lot to do. That's only 1.6% of the Fortune 500 CEOs. But still, even though this work is important, it's necessary, I believe that it will result in great outcomes. There will be resistance. I've worked in organizations where we were in the midst of rolling out a training initiative only to get an email or a notice that came out that said, cancel all diversity training. I happened at that time to be working for a CEO who kind of rolled his eyes and said, continue on, Monica. So that's what we did. But that's the kind of backing you need from the top person. But who you put in that position, apart from the technical skills that person has, they need to be competent. They need to understand what's going on. They need to be compassionate. They need to be able to listen to someone and be empathetic toward that person's experience, even though they've never lived it. And that's important. They need to be courageous, able to speak truth to power. And that sounds like a cliche, and I guess it is. We use it all the time. But that's important. And a lot of folk have difficulty doing that. There is risk that comes with that. Especially one of the things they found is that the higher paid, the higher level and higher paid the diversity officer, it was like golden handcuffs. They didn't want to lose that job. They didn't want to lose that money, that good pay. And so they shied away from telling or standing up to the CEO and the leaders and informing them of what they needed to do. So that means you need a person who's committed. These things, these changes are not going to happen in a short time. They're not going to happen in 1 to 2 to 3 years. It's like people development. You don't develop your people in your company for 2 years and say, that's it. It's for the whole, it's for the duration. And so, you've got to have someone who's like that. You've got to have somebody who is civil, who is able to engage with people who are different, but more importantly, listen to opinions that are different from their own. That was my biggest challenge, because I was ready to tell them, hold up, cut them off, say, nope, that's wrong. Let me tell you why it's wrong. Can't do that and build good relationships. And you need those relationships to help you do this work. The other thing I will share with you is that there are very specific drivers and enablers to help move forward your strategic D&I initiatives. And some of them have a lot of proven track records, like you'll hear about CEO-led diversity councils, employee resource groups, mentoring programs, senior level sponsorship initiatives. That's probably one of my favorite. I advocate that everywhere I work, because a sponsorship is different from a mentoring program. Sponsorships are people who are in senior level positions, who are in the room when decisions are made about who's going to be advanced to the next level or put on the track for those critical higher level positions. If you have a sponsor that brings up your name and say, well, hold it. What about Cindy? She's been here doing thus and so for all these years. She's a great employee. I think she ought to be put in. And people might say, yeah, you know what? We hadn't even thought about that. Because oftentimes that's what they say. We haven't even thought about it. Well, yeah, think about it. Now put her on the list for the development. That's how things get done, especially with critical career pathing and talent reviews. So there are a number of things that can be done that work, but they do take persistence and patience in some cases. But again, I want to say that this work is so, and it's work that I'm passionate about. Because I think it's important. I think it's important not only for individuals, but for the company, for our communities, and for our nations. And I think a lot of the disruption and animosity that we have going on now is because people feel like one group is taken from another group, and if they get ahead, then we're going to be pushed back. It's been set up like it's a competition. But the fact of the matter is that an effective D&I strategy grows your business. It will multiply opportunities so that you can share that with employees and they'll know that there's enough to go around. This work can sometimes be tough, but I believe that where there's a will, there's a way. And I commend you for taking it on, and I thank you for your attention this evening. So I don't, if you have time for the question and answers or no. Okay, okay, great.
We're just going to stay whole group, right? Yeah.
Okay. Where is you? Okay. All right. Let's give our speaker another round of applause. I think she did a really excellent job of, highlighting what has been done, what are the challenges, and how all of that is sort of related to the anti-racism work, because it's not really being said that it's racist, but you could see from the results of the data that she provided, it is leaning that way. It looks that way. So again, we have some questions that we want to ask, and we want people to come up, okay, to the microphone. Dr. Martin has the microphone. So we have a few questions. So why eradicating versus undoing racism? What do you think the difference is there? Yes.
One of the things I have, uh, I'm seeking to truly understand when we use the term racism, because I think when you try to make people realize it's been in society for a while, it's seeing like you're doing some reverse racism now. So I'm trying to get a good understanding of racism itself, but eradicating versus undoing, I think it truly needs to be eradicated, and I guess I would be a little confused saying undoing it. Maybe it's the same, but I'm looking for that understanding myself.
For me, eradicating means the heart. How do you take it out of a person's heart? Whereas undoing feels more like we're going to put processes in place to force people to do different things. How do we get to the heart? That's what it means for me.
So what I hear you saying is that undoing may deal more with the external factors, where eradicating is really dealing with who we are internally.
One of the things that I really didn't have time to explore, but I would encourage each of you who've not read Caste by Isabella Wickerson, because what she explains in the book is that we're not just dealing with race. We're dealing with a caste system that has been in place for years. And she describes race and those physical characteristics we can see is the skin, but the bones, the structure, is a caste system that no matter how high you climb with respect to your education, how much money you make, that you would still be perceived as that lowest level. And particularly for Black, she does not hold back. She said, they're at the Black people at the very bottom. And we're seeing that way across the world. So that took my work to a whole different level, because now I know it's not just the programs and the initiatives, but how do you really begin to change mindset? And that's where work really began.
I'm excited you brought up Caste. There's a movie out, Origins, by Ava DuVernay, and it is not a transcription of the book. It is the journey that Isabel Wilkerson took in writing the book, and it really helps to develop that theme of ranking and caste. And just as a quick example, I mentioned to you that I've been in education for over 45 years, and I have my PhD. But when I walk into a room, even if I have on a three-piece suit, if people don't know me, they still tighten up and tense of who is this Black man and what is he bringing to the table. I get asked all the time, why do I talk the way I did, or how did I learn? And it's like, well, my mom was a teacher. All, I just talk. But that ranking and that caste is almost in who we are as a society, and we have to intentionally work to change those hearts and change how we look at each other. So, Caste the book and Origins the movie, highly recommend. Do you have your hand up?
I think, kind of going back to the internal as opposed to the external, I find that racism is not clearly defined, in that people don't necessarily understand what is racism. And I think part of that is like, okay, so I can, as a Black woman, I can say, okay, I perceive whatever as racist. Whereas, the the source of that doesn't necessarily perceive it that way. And yes, and that's the other thing. They tell you, well, no, they want to defend what they're, it's like, but I'm sorry, you can't tell me what I consider to be racist. I can tell you that I consider it to be racist, and you can, accept it as is. You can't argue with me about that. And I find that a lot. And it's funny you said that, because okay, so before I grew these, my hair was not much longer than yours. But I would find, and I still get this sometimes, I'll talk to somebody or maybe develop a relationship with them over a period of time on the phone. But when they see me, I can tell right away that they're taken aback, because I don't look like what they expected when they were talking on the phone. And, and so that's why I say, they don't necessarily perceive that as racist. And that's where we have to get to.
And then I also see racism as being more about the treatment. I think many times we overlook about how people are being treated. And I think that's a problem. If you go back into the early 60s, during the riots and whatnot, when, people were just trying to go into buildings to apply for jobs, not saying that they were going to get the job. They were just trying to get into the building. They were being hosed down by dogs if you were Black, but everybody else could go in and apply. So if you kind of go back and look at some of those pictures during the 60s, then you can kind of get a better understanding. I think racism means different things to different people. I think if you're like myself, an African American person, where my parents came from Alabama, and they had, different drinking fountains, one for African Americans, one for, if you go back and read it, then it's very easy to understand exactly what, racism is, because it's going to look different. And if you're not touched by it, it's not going to be as deep and penetrating as if, you're just reading it in a book. But like I said, my parents, my grandmother, the only work my grandmother could get in Minneapolis, Minnesota, was cleaning the houses of white people. And I attended with her many of those times. But now, today, I'm a Harvard graduate. I have a PhD from Columbia. It looks very different. But still, the treatment, I'm still getting the treatment too. Even though I have all of that, I'm still getting the treatment. So you kind of have to hold on and kind of look at it from that point of view. Our next question is, what is the individual harm of racism? And what is the societal harm? So can we get some perspective on that?
And I think too, as we think about that the harm and the individual and societal harm goes both ways. It is not just, it is more severe to African Americans, but white America is harmed also. There is a yin yang harm that's happening in society. We are not reaching our fullest potential. We're not reaching our fullest value as a society as long as racism continues to be endemic and a part.
I think one of the things that our speaker, Ms. Emerson, was bringing out was the economic side of all this. And to be truthful, when you talk about the economics of it, and our country don't want to face this, but that's where it started to be separated when you actually go back to even the slavery aspect. People who've never experienced your ancestors coming from a slave perspective and being forced to work for nothing, and it's like cast it down and down and down through the years, it's a lot of harm because now some people feel more superior by just the way our economics was built in our country. So we have to try to eradicate that. And that's where I think it really boils down to economics.
When you're talking about the trickle down of economics, I think of that from an educator's perspective. So when we're thinking about, our students in the classroom and they never see a teacher who looks like them, all of the research shows the impact that that has. And then when you have on the flip side, if they have just one teacher of color or one teacher who looks like them throughout their entire 12, 16, 20 years of education, they go further, right? But no matter who the teacher is in the classroom, if students don't have curricular materials that speak to their experience, if they don't have materials that celebrate joy. We were talking about American Fiction. If you haven't seen that movie, you need to see it. But this idea of what a Black story is, right? And so there's been some amazing work being done in literature, but also when are we ever celebrating Black joy and Black genius in the classroom, right? So in the same way economics has this trickle-down effect, we're seeing it in classrooms too. And so when I work with pre-service teachers and I try to debunk the idea right away of like color blindness, right? Like, I don't see color. No, baby, you do. So let's talk about that so that when you go into the classroom and you work with somebody else's baby, you're not going to say that it doesn't matter if you're red, purple, or rainbow, right? Like, let's actually be teachers for all children. So when we talk about this trickle down, we need to fix the classrooms too. Back your job.
Oh, sorry. That light.
Something else, and we haven't touched on this, but it struck me when you were talking about economics and things like that. I did see American Fiction, but I also saw Killers of the, of whatever, a flower, a Flower Moon, and I was shocked. And I mean, I don't know if you've all seen it to know what the storyline is, but I mean, now, just in recent history, we've heard about the Tulsa Massacre. Mm-hmm. But this is a true story that happened to Native Americans also in Oklahoma. And, my husband and I watched it, and people keep talking about how long it is. I couldn't get past the whole premise of it, we already know that Native Americans, they're Native. This is their country. White man came and took it over. And then just cast them off to, okay, you just go over there and you stay and you do whatever you want to do in your area, but, leave us alone. But it was so much more than that. And I was in shock. It's like, but that is the harm, because this is a history that we don't know. We haven't been taught. And especially now, our history is trying to be sugar-coated. And so, that's a whole nother issue. And that is the harm, because we're going to raise a generation of ignorant people.
And I hate to But I'm so glad that you said what you said, because the educational system is the key to it. And me being a black man, I have very few other men who say they want to get into the elementary education as black men. And so by the time we get a chance to reach them, when we do start reaching them, it's so entrenched because they have not seen us. And I can't blame you all as educators, but it's white females mostly teaching kids K-5. And that's where it's being embedded to some degree, just with what they're seeing. And if we can't find a way to change that, it's going to be continue to be a challenge. And I don't blame the educators, because you are, but as you start understanding, we have to try to find a way to promote a more diverse educational system in the K-5 system. We do have to do that.
Thank you for bringing out that point. One of the things we got to do is raise the salaries of our teachers. I mean, we got educators. It's hard to tell somebody, pursue a career in education, and you're going to start off making 35,000 when you can go someplace else and start off making 85,000. So we've got to change the perception of education and the importance of that in our community. Until our nation, and I talk from a broad perspective because I believe it, until we start to value each individual, we're going to continue to spiral downward. When you look at our position across, compared to other nations, you'd be surprised at our standing, because we tell ourselves we're the best nation in the world, we're the richest nation in the world. But I will tell you, in terms of quality of life, we're rapidly sliding down. And I often use an example of, it's like if you have a basketball team, and the only people that you pay attention to is your starting five, and everybody else just sits on the bench. If something happens to one of them and you got to pull a player in, you can't win the game because they haven't been coached and they haven't been taught the same way. So again, these things have really broad impact. I mean, when you spoke of teachers, I thought about the medical profession, doctors, and the disparities that exist from the time a child will go into an emergency room and they get different treatment, probably not intentionally. I don't think, somebody looks at them and say, here come a black child, let me not pay attention to what they're saying. Because that's the unconscious bias. But that child ends up getting lesser treatment, lesser examinations, and everything else than a white child would get the same age. They could be 3, 4, 5 years old. So absolutely, absolutely.
So I almost started mansplaining, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to ask Dr. Lagaki to explain the process she took the teacher ed program through in the last couple of years.
So at Oakland, when we redesigned the elementary education program, I was a dumb baby professor who said, yeah, I'll do it, thinking that I was just like running some meetings, right? And it turned into redesigning our entire program. And so I said, okay, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it in a way that's actually going to matter. So in our actual core philosophies of our education program, we have a commitment to teaching for social justice and equity. We have different principles in there. And I got some pushback, and it was, well, are we indoctrinating our future teachers? And I said, no, I freaking hate that word. But also, even if we were, if they don't want that, they shouldn't be a teacher. But then they can go be trained somewhere else, right? I'm not going to sign off on somebody going out into the education field who's going to do harm to other people's children. And being passive and not letting all children see themselves in the classroom, not letting all children be celebrated in the classroom, you are doing harm, even if you think it's not active. So in our elementary education program, we have a number of stopgaps to make sure that their core philosophies are in line with the changes we want to see out in the program. We don't have just that one diversity course. I'm the lady who teaches that one, and my teaching evaluations show it. But it's embedded throughout every class, right? So all 4 semesters of their professional program, they're seeing the same ideas over and over. And so the problem is, the research shows once they leave us, that they're so excited they're going to go change the world, right? And then depending on what school they get into, that gets beaten out of them really quickly unless they have some co-conspirators. So right now I'm working with a group of young teachers who are out in the field to kind of keep that fire going in their first 3 years, because if they can hang on to it for just the first couple years, they will hang on to it. So there's a lot of us who are looking to make change. That's actually how Dr. Martin and I found each other, as we said we need more Black men in the teaching field, and that was our work at first. And then we kind of looked around, and then we looked at Dr. Scott, and we said, we have a lot of work to do before we can say, yes, Black men, yes, Black women, come to our school, because I refuse to recruit somebody into a space that's not ready for them. And so it's this domino effect, right? Like, I know where we need to get to and what we need to do, but we need to clean up our own home first. But we're getting there. So and we do a lot of work in Pontiac. So I think that probably leads to our next question there.
I just wanted to not mansplain also Dr. Scott. So Dr. Scott, would you tell them about the certificate program that speaks to the business society and
Okay.
part of?
I'll woman-splain. Yeah, so like in 2019, we started the Graduate Human Diversity and Social Justice Certificate Program. And it was an idea I had for, students who wanted to move beyond the one course that we have. And if you look at LinkedIn, there's a plethora of jobs in diversity. But my question is, how are people getting these jobs? Because they don't really have the knowledge and the competencies to move forward. And so we started the program for graduate students. It's also open to business professionals who want to come back and have some more conversation and some more learning, because as was pointed out by our speaker, a lot of people are just kind of thrown into these jobs. We're going to start a diversity program, and then this person is going to be ahead of it. Nobody's asking, is that person competent? What are they going to be bringing to the table? So basically, we started in 2019, and it's going very well. We have students really excited and, speaking out about it, getting jobs and reporting back. So that's one of the things we've done at Oakland, is to move this education further for people, because, the jobs are there, but the competencies are not. Okay, so let's move on to our last couple of questions. How is Pontiac specifically impacted by generational racism, and what should Pontiac do to address racism?
Being born and raised in Pontiac here from, now over 60 years, I can say Pontiac itself was built around an economy that was built around GM. And when GM was looking for workers, they weren't looking for educated people. They was looking for folks to come and be able to get on the assembly line, and it afforded an opportunity for them to take care of their families. And they really, with union support, was almost moving to what you would call middle class. But when you move that out of Pontiac, and you have not promoted education in the way that it should be, and then the challenges with education at the same time, I found to answer this question is, I never thought of myself as being an educator, but as a community activist, allowed to go into the schools and interact with those young kids is one of the best things that we could have doing. Now, you're not always welcome in there, but those times you get a chance to come in there. I'm working with a GM program. They're trying to entice the young people for being engineers. And as a community person, I go in and work with some fourth graders. Now, both of the classes we work with has a white female teacher. And it's a very diverse class. Matter of fact, there's only 2 or 3 white kids in there. But they are so embraced by seeing a Black man come in there and they warm to me. I can just tell it. So we've got to promote that, because otherwise it's going to continue to happen. And we got to just find a way to reach them at an early age, a real early age. And I think those educators are going to have to embrace community people to come in, because you're absolutely right. The pay does not promote for a Black man to take care of his family at the educator's pay for elementary school. So we usually try to elevate to something to a higher pay.
Yeah, or move to a district that pays higher. Right, right.
Yeah, I agree that Pontiac has had, our history has been the auto industry. I worked in that industry for many, many years, and it did afford men and women the opportunity to provide a living wage for their families, and that has gone away. And so that transition to a non-manufacturing culture has been a tough one for our city. It has not been one, I think, that city government has addressed in an effective way. They have not been effective in really trying to deal with that, and that's caused a problem. But I think one of the specific impacts of generational racism that I think has impacted Pontiac has just been uh, poverty and just low, people who are not making the money. When you look at the welfare system in Pontiac, the impact it has had on single families and really all families, I think that has created generational racism, because when children grow up in that welfare system and women raise children, and then those children come up and go into the same system, that to me is generational racism. Because you're not giving these children the opportunity they should have. As Americans, as children, they simply do not have the opportunities. The systemic racism that our families have had to suffer with that whole welfare system, which has never operated in the best interest of these people. I think it's been a horrible generational. I think this is the thing that has hurt us the most, because it has had impact on the families. And when you have, when families are broken and fractured because we have all of these horrible racist systems in place, uh, once the family is the building block of society. And when you have fractured the family with racist policies, and policies that continue to de-emphasize certain people, then it has great impact. It has great impact.
I'm sorry. Absolutely. It's brokenness, systemic, personal, collective. It is 7:50, and so we need to leave by 8 because we have another group coming in. Thank you so much for your attention. And again, thank you, Dr. Emerson. It was marvelous.
Oh, sure. So if you could just take 2 minutes and pull out your cell phone, we have a QR code here that will take you to a survey. It'll just help us in terms of planning our next event, making sure that you're getting what you need. We understand what you got out of this. It would just be really helpful, and it shouldn't take too long at all. And then on your way out, Dr. Martin is setting up some books in the back. Feel free to take one or more. We have an amazing book by Dr. Scott, which speaks about her work in Minnesota and some community work that's been done there. And then some amazing books, 2 forms of the same book, one a young adult version, and then one just the originally published version. So we're very grateful for you being here. In April, we will have an event online only, and we'll be sharing that information soon. And then in May, we'll be having another town hall with some more food and just a greater gathering of people. Hopefully the weather will be nicer and we'll get some more folks out here. So Anisha, I'm going to give this back to you.
Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you everyone for attending. On behalf of Dr. Semino Scott, the Executive Director of Pontiac Collective Impact Partnership, thank you all for braving the raindrops and the drops in temperature. I know when you registered, it was spring-like. You were like, that'd be a nice thing to do. But thank you so much. And I mean, this issue is nowhere near over, and we are PCIP, one of our core goals as a collective impact organization is to address these institutional systematic problems that have thwarted progress in cities like Pontiac. And so this is timely, and we know it's nowhere near over. And so we're really thankful for you all coming out and indulging. If you want to get involved with the Institute for Eradicating Racism, please make sure you see Dr. Martin before you leave. She mentioned that books are available, and please complete the survey. And last but not least, they have a wonderful Afro-pop group coming this evening, right after we leave. So if you want to hang around and hear some good music, this is a great opportunity to do it and enjoy some food by one of my favorite restaurants, Yum Village. And it's very tasty. So thank you again, and we hope to see and hear from you down the road as we continue this discussion.